right, good afternoon. I think let's start off introducing ourselves.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon to you, and thanks for taking time to meet with us on this Thursday afternoon. Got a pretty interesting program lined up for you today, and we've got two excellent guest speakers with us. Well, to kick things off, my name is Xiang. I'm the MD for Asia for Avvanz. We are a HR technology company very focused on, two facets of the HR journey, one being background screening and the other training. But I don't want to steal too much of our panelists and our presenters. Just get cracking on introducing them. But before we get into that, this is how things will kind of work for this webinar. Francesca, who is here, and Kanan will be our two key speakers. As they conclude their pitches, please feel free to kind of feed into our chat any questions that you have along the way. And also included in this particular call, we have Vince, who is our marketing specialist at Avvanz. So Francesca Dickson, she's a guru in risk management, having now running her own consultancy. She's a veteran in the risk and governance space. Having more than 20 years working with listed companies, as well as tech and also in the payment space. She likes to say that, it's not about processes, it's about building a culture of risk. And then she'll walk us through exactly the 5 steps of building that culture. And on this call, also we have Kanan Chetia, who is our CEO and co-founder for Avvanz, my boss effectively. Kanan is a very experienced practitioner in the HR space, having worked with technology companies and enterprise 500 organizations, right, to build up, to manage people, but also playing a big role in HR management. So without further ado, let me quickly welcome Francesca, and she will take us away with her presentation on the 5 stages of creating a strong risk culture. Francesca, please.
Hi, everyone. Thank you. Thank you, Xiang. And welcome to this webinar series and our topic today about the 5 stages of creating a strong risk culture. And I just want to thank Avvanz for organising this series and this webinar on this important topic. So during the webinar, we're going to talk about why a culture-first approach to risk is essential in these times that we live in, and exactly what risk culture is. I want to share some of my insights and experience and some of my ideas of what we can do as risk leaders, HR leaders, or people and culture leaders to make risk culture come to life and the stages that this requires in my experience. If you have any questions during the presentation, just pop them in the chat and then we'll stop at some intervals and have a look and answer them between Kanan and I. And then at the end of the presentation, we'll make sure there's a dedicated spot for questions that we don't get to throughout. And then I'll also share about how else I can further help should you need any help after today. So a pretty good introduction there from the start, but what I wanted to really talk about, you can see the formal background there on the screen, but what I really wanted to talk about through my experience is why I think risk culture is important, because you've got the formal story there, but what I wanted to share with you is my light bulb moment. It's when I realized throughout all the work that I had done across risk management, whether it was operational, strategic, whether we were talking about cyber, whether we were talking about risk appetite, whether we were talking about training or crisis management, that really when we talk about risk maturity, risk culture, speaking up, ethics and accountability, or even when we're talking about, how can we get people to use the controls that we've put in place, we're really talking about people and we're talking about culture. And whatever else we do in risk management, however else we tweak our technical frameworks and our systems, culture is the part that we really need underneath to make sure that we get real results. And what I found in my career is that when we start focusing heavily on risk culture, that's when I saw the biggest and most impactful results. And it doesn't matter what area that you're talking about. And I just wanted to make that point for people who are listening, because I know that risk leaders have registered, people working in HR and other areas have registered for this call. And so for those of you who are less involved in the intricacies of risk, I think there is still a lot to offer in terms of how they can help make our organizations a success. Because what I always found is that when people understand the why of risk, and then when we make it easy for them to do the how, then they're more engaged, they're more productive, and ultimately as somebody who was in charge of risk, that provided me with more assurance that my organisation was prepared and was resilient. So I concluded that the human element of risk is actually the most critical aspect. There are ways, effective ways to harness this, and I really want to share them with people. So let's first talk about the world that we're living in, the zeitgeist, because we know that we're living in a world of uncertainty. It's certainly not the world I was born into, and probably not most people who are listening to this. I heard a speaker the other day who had worked in international diplomacy talking about potentially the end of globalization in the way that we've known it and the way that we've profited from it. And we don't know exactly how it will change or what it will replace. And so we need to be resilient, and we need to be prepared and proactive no matter what comes our way. In January of this year, the World Economic Forum's annual risk report talked about the possibility of the year being the year of the polycrisis. Essentially, so many different crises up on top of each other, be they geopolitical, climate, extreme weather, or cyber, that the compounded effect would be greater than the individual parts, and also that we cannot actually prepare for every type of risk. So where we can't do that, we need to be aware, we need to make sure our people are aware, and we need to make sure that they understand. Similarly, in parallel to this, we also have our workplaces that are becoming more empowered. We've seen, an increase even in those companies that weren't doing hybrid work, weren't involved in work from home and hybrid working to the same extent. Now, empowering their employees. Employees are demanding it, particularly the younger generations. And it's really improving our companies. But if we want to do this, if we want people to be empowered, we want to control them less, and we are about risks and controls, but we want to control them less on a day-to-day basis, then they need to have a culture of awareness and understanding so that they can make decisions on their own that will nonetheless manage risks for our companies. We also see stakeholders taking more notice as a result of the pandemic, one of those events that nobody thought would happen. I actually questioned right before the pandemic whether I should run a crisis exercise with a scenario of a pandemic because I thought it was too much of an outlier. So in that particular case, now we know that leaders and boards are taking it more seriously, and that they expect us to be strong on managing risk and culture. And then the last part there around engagement driving action. There's a lot of talk at the moment about great resignations and burnout and people not being engaged with their organizations. So if they're not engaged with their organization, if your people aren't engaged, they're also not going to manage risk because they don't care. So those areas are all coming together to make this more crucial. The report that I just talked about earlier, I'll just give you a flavour of it there. The number of different types of economic, environmental, geopolitical, societal and technology risks that we are facing globally. But equally, you could also recreate this for your own organisation and it would be just as interconnected. The point of this is to know that we cannot know or prepare for every risk, but we need our people to be risk aware, to understand what is expected and then take action. But what is risk culture when you look at it? All right, so look at what's risk culture. If you ask the internet, risk culture is a system of values and behaviours present in an organisation that shapes risk decisions and management of employees. It is a term that describes the values, beliefs, knowledge, attitudes and understanding of risk. And I haven't even put that on the screen because it is basically the general description of what culture is and risk, and that you can also Google that for yourself. But what I really wanted to focus on is what are the practical questions that come up? And the first one, mainly the first one there, because I get this all the time from from HR people in particular. And that question is there even such a thing as a risk culture? Or is there just culture? And in that sense, there isn't actually a risk culture that can exist in a vacuum. It's not this separate thing that you can work on, divorced from the rest of your organisation and the rest of the culture, with no reference to the prevailing culture. So what we're really talking about is how do we view and act in relation to risk within our larger culture? And the message for risk people there is that you're very unlikely to be able to do it on your own without buying in and support of those who shape the wider culture. And the message for those in charge of culture generally is to think about how you're supporting the shaping of risk within your own culture that would enable your organisation's success, and how can you work with those who are in charge of risk. because you certainly can't have a risk culture or attitude of risk that's diametrically opposed to the overall culture. You can't say, let's be conservative in a culture that rewards cowboys, but also the opposite. You can't expect people to automatically take more risks and stand up and be proactive in a culture that rewards strict compliance and obedience. But what you can do is decide in your own context, how do we want people to think about risk? What do we want people to do? And then how can we align that to our overall expectations and culture? And you can embed it into your ways of working, processes, goals, and reward that makes it easy for people. But we'll get into that. The point I want to make here is that before you plunge into the metrics and details of a risk culture program, think about what is the shared understanding or meaning that you want your people to have. And then you can think about how you want to do that. So I'm going to jump into the 5 stages of risk culture. But just before I do that, Canon, with what I just said earlier around the world, is that what you're seeing with your clients? What are you seeing in terms of their attitude to risk since, before the pandemic and some of these other issues that we've had in the world?
Yeah, thanks for that. So, our clients obviously cut across all industries, multiple geographies. And I would say generally the risk management to them before and after COVID looks a bit different, right? Because in terms of business control, business continuity planning, taking risks in terms of a pandemic hitting the day-to-day business. So there's a lot of, I think a lot of them already had a risk culture, but I believe now they are fine-tuning it. And now I think the thought process is also to expect the unexpected, right? So you cannot just look at your current risk. You cannot just look at a potential risk, but I think you need to foresee a risk and think about your plan A, B, C for that. So yeah, I'm quite interested to see what you're going to talk about in terms of the risk culture. And then I think all the attendees should start thinking about how are they already there yet, or is this something they need to start embedding it? Because I think most of our clients already have a certain kind of risk assessment strategy, but it's all about tuning it, right? And making sure it cannot be 100% bulletproof. I think you already know that, but I think if you can get near to that, I think they are probably already winning the game, right?
Thank you. So this is a good time to start talking about how would we look at risk culture? How should we measure it? How do we make changes? So I'm going to take you through 5 steps. I'm going to mention that the first 2 can be flipped, and I'll explain why. But we're looking at the target state risk culture, shaping, defining what does good look like? What does a good risk culture look like for you? Assessing your current culture and any gaps against your target state. The strategy and roadmap for developing improvements or creating risk culture to the extent that it doesn't exist already in execution, taking a change management approach, and then different ways to measure and sustain. Okay, so first of all, target state. So a lot of people that I speak to when they look to do risk culture, look to do the assessment first. And that's actually how I used to look at it as well. But what I realized was that was the reason I always did it first was because I had an idea of what I thought good risk culture was, and I'd shared it with leaders and they agreed. So so if you haven't done that though, why might you look at your target state first? Because it helps you undergo your assessment and make the most of those resources and investment that you're putting into it. It will help you look at the scope of what you want to assess and measure, because people say, what should we measure? And you can download things on the internet, you can come up with hundreds of questions, but what you will have the most impact is when you look at the scope of what you assess and measure and make sure it's really relevant to the goals of your organization, the particular issues that they have. Certainly taking a general approach is better than taking no approach, but the far more impactful approach is to take some considerations into account. Because otherwise you end up with a questionnaire or something like that. You end up with with some answers and you say, this is our risk culture, but then you don't know what to do with it, because was it good? Was the analyst comes out as particularly bad, but if, is this what we want? And then you kind of just keep reporting it, but not for no particular reason. So consider what the particular drivers are for assessing risk culture in the organization. Sure, there might be some sort of regulatory standard that you need to assess against, but also what issues have you had in the past that might make you think that there are areas of risk culture to improve? So have you had conduct problems? So therefore, your net risk culture assessments want to focus on people's behavior in terms of their conduct, in terms of their ethics. Or have you had system outages and you want to make people be more proactive in patching and, doing backups and that sort of thing, and take a more professional approach? Or have there been safety issues, legal breaches, maybe badly decided investments, and you want to know, well, how are people, using the company's money and that sort of thing? Or perhaps you just hold a lot of sensitive data and you know that there are many data breaches happening in the world at the moment and you want people to look after them. So if you're a nationally critical organization, it'll be quite different to when you're a startup that is taking lots of risks. So these things affect your risk appetite, and they'll also affect your culture. You'd consider whether you're actually wanting people to be more reliable, to contribute to a more reliable and trusted reputation for your company, or do you need them to move fast and take more risks? So where you want to be can inform where you start, the questions you ask, and the processes that you look at. An important point at this point, though, I think, is that it needs to be a shared goal beyond the risk team or whoever is doing this assessment. You need to be on the same page. So we'll come back to this target state, because even if you start here, you need to look at it again. Secondly, we talk about risk culture assessment. So when you assess your risk culture, you're really establishing a baseline for what you want to stop, what you want to continue, and what you want to change or introduce in relation to risk culture. And your circumstances will depend on how deep you want to go with this. So when would you do this first? You do this first, as I said, if you already had a shared vision of what you want a strong risk culture to look like, or perhaps if you need to demonstrate to stakeholders why you need to do the exercise in the first place. Perhaps you want to use more resources from your team, you want other people to help you, you need a budget, you want this priority to be supported by evidence and metrics. That's where you might do this risk assessment first, particularly if you think it's going to find things that need to be remediated. So how do we go about doing that? So one method is to ask people. You can do this, like I say, through online questions, but you might also want to engage in focus groups and targeted interviews with those that are important. You're looking at things like gauging their awareness levels of what risk is and what your process is, awareness of key risks facing your organisation. Do they know what they are? Do they know what's expected of them and how they can help? What do they understand risk to be? And what is their attitude to it? And does it differ within your organisation? Is the employee's attitude higher or lower than management's? What is the perception of how your organisation is doing, and do leaders role model positive risk behaviour? So these are the sorts of questions that you might ask people directly. But secondly, apart from asking people, you might utilise observations. They might be yours. They could come through employee surveys, but they could come through external audits and reviews where you've had other audits that weren't necessarily about risk culture. What have they talked about? What have they mentioned in terms of people's behaviour or the way that they manage risk? What complaints and similarly, what praises might have come through from your customers that would tell you where you may or may not be doing a good job. And then thirdly, you look at where is risk embedded. So to what extent is embedded? And by that, I mean, you could look at your risk framework and say, does it reference it at all? But at a high level, is it included in board and committee agendas and decisions? Is it typically included in business cases when you're moving into a new, you might be moving into a new product, making a technology change, doing an upgrade, and so on? Is it included in those project forums, those decision-making? Is it included in your company goals? Does the company, do you record the company at a high level on risk due to a scorecard or OKRs, sorry. And is it included in people's personal goals? Are they rewarded at all when they manage risk well? Is there any consequence for not doing it? There are a myriad of places that you can embed risk into to make things easier for people. And part of this is, well, which ones are relevant to you and which ones do you want to check? And at this point, I'll just mention, in terms of assessing culture, keeping some of these barriers in mind. So why don't people just do what the framework says? Any framework, your risk framework, any of your people frameworks, if you put in a risk culture framework, why would it not be followed? So the three barriers are they don't know. And that sounds so simple, but actually it's very important, because sometimes when you're sitting in your own department and you're dealing with it all the time and you're reporting to boards and you're having workshops, you don't realize that there are other people in the organization who just don't know what you do, don't know that you even have a document they're supposed to be using, controls they're supposed to be following. that's actually quite a simple one to fix. Maybe they don't care. They might know, but they don't care because you haven't made it relevant enough to them. They don't know why it's important, or why, you know, they should be prioritizing it in terms of everything else they do. Or you might be giving them competing incentives, and that's where reward and goals and that sort of thing becomes important, because if you're rewarding them for not following what you're saying, then that's going to be difficult. And the third one is it's just too hard. Sometimes the processes can be seen as red tape, separate from strategy, goals, culture, and ways of working. Or people feel the risk process itself is just too frustrating. So are you taking a human-centered approach to that and making it as easy as people to follow? And I was actually going to ask you about this, Canon, as well, in terms of some of the processes that you guys have. How do you make sure that if you put in place something like an employee onboarding process or due diligence for a company, how do you make it easy for people within that company to use so that it's not, you know, a white elephant that people have bought?
Yeah, thanks for asking that. In fact, I was just reading a report this morning, I think it's from KPMG or Forbes. Out of the top 10 business risks to any kind of business in 2023, people-related risk seems to be number one, right? Because they're the ones who eventually cause your cyber or data security or IT security related breaches and all that, which is why it's very important that you really know who you hire. Because I always like to say, you don't know what you don't know, right? So you need to make sure that when you onboard them, you thoroughly vet the people, right? Which is where the background checks come in. Like, for example, in Australia, AFP check, the Australian Federal Police check is very important. But that's not the only thing, right? It's not just a criminal background. You also want to know whether they have any inflated employment background, or do they have fake credentials, which is a big problem now. Out of every 10 profiles we see about 3 to 4 of them have such discrepancies. And there could be undeclared derogatory background. I mean, a lot of these things, right? So obviously that's where we come in. But other than the individual level background checks, got to think about, I think we should stretch the thought to also partners, right? So when you're onboarding employees, okay, there's a background checking process. But what about when you're onboarding partners or contractors into your ecosystem of your business? They could be your customers, they could be your subcontractors or vendors, could be integration partners, especially if it's an API integrated partners. You really need to know them very well, which is where the company due diligence comes in, right? Especially now, I think there's a lot of money laundering scandals and political exposure, terrorism, financing, the CTFs and the AMLs. A lot of this going on in every jurisdiction now, every day. And I think we need to be able to manage that risk, which is where company due diligence also comes in. So I think we should think about not just internal, but the external as part of the entire ecosystem as well. And that these are all important components when you assess the risks. Does it make sense?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think it sort of illustrates the potential breadth of what you might be assessing. So yes, you're assessing, because people automatically think we're assessing the attitudes and behaviors of people, and we absolutely need to do that, and their awareness, but also looking at your company's systems and your controls, and where you've embedded the requirement to have these is also, you know, and again, depending on your organization, what you might look at as well in scope for your assessment.
Yeah, and if I can just add to that, on the ground, what we're experiencing, and this is from my clients and the very conservative financial institutions and so on, they're really expanding their scope of, risk management and risk assessment, right? They're even looking at stuff like, and this is what we do on a day-to-day basis, background checks on social media as well, which previously, if you talked about, checks on social media, maybe as recent as 3 or 4 years ago, it's a bit of a taboo, right? No one wants to get into that. But these days, we're seeing banking organizations, real conservative ones, approaching us and having us run these checks on their potential hires. But we're seeing it being run on their vendors as well, right? Because outsourcing is so big these days, right? Yeah. So the entire scope and the entire field of view has changed tremendously over the last few years, right?
Thank you.
And traditionally banks only do things if the regulatory framework or requires them to do so, right? But I think social media checks, I don't think any government regulatory framework requires that, but yet all the companies are doing that, because I guess it covers your Google, it covers a lot of data points, which I think people really want to know before they hire. Yeah.
That's really interesting. And I think, when we come to talk about how we communicate desired risk cultures and things with employees, if that's something that that particular organization is interested in, then employees need to know about it, right? Rather than just, tripping them up and saying, by the way, we did this check and now, and now there's issues, telling them in advance, this is what we expect. But financial services is a good segue into this next slide, which I've included mainly because I've been talking quite generally because I believe, tailoring, as I keep saying, is really important. However, I know that there will be people who will be watching this webinar who just want to know some concrete examples, like what do I need to look at when I'm assessing a risk culture? And I've taken this from the Australian Prudential Regulation Authority, which is the financial services regulator in Australia around banking and insurance and superannuation and so on. One of the reasons I'm using it is it's quite general in that it doesn't have to apply to financial services, since this isn't a financial services webinar, but it's something that you can use. And I do know that I was talking to someone in London last week who was actually using this. So it is quite a well-known standard. So you can have a look at that, but it looks at, those elements of that you might put into a questionnaire or into your focus groups and discussions around how leadership views risk and how others view leadership. What decision-making forums are there? Are people willing to speak up in communication, capabilities, and then alignment? As I keep saying, you need to align it to your own organisation, so alignment to purpose and values, and then looking at the actual risk architecture. And by that, I think they mean the risk framework documents that you have, or anything that makes up your suite of risk policies. And do they include, this board oversight of this cultural assessment? Does it align to your risk appetite and strategy, governance, controls, responsibility, and performance management, which we've already talked about, and incentives, which we have mentioned a couple of times. Okay, so moving on to strategy and roadmap, and I'm talking about your risk strategy and your risk roadmap here. So this is where you are revisiting that earlier question: what does a strong risk culture look like to you? And once you've done an assessment, however you've done that assessment, whether it was a really in-depth one or a shorter one, you should have an idea of what a strong risk culture looks like, but specifically, what does a strong risk culture look like for your organisation? And because you've done the assessment, then you can look at what the gaps are between, this picture of what you've desired, how embedded you want it to be, how aware you want people to be, where are the gaps, where are they in particular in the organisation? Is it aligned? And then again, I'm talking about, is it aligned to your to your company's purpose? What is it trying to achieve? What reputation does it, what sort of people does it have? So is your risk culture aligned to that? And is it aligned to the greater culture? Because that actually also goes to, will it help us succeed? If it's not aligned to those things, like if you as a risk team have decided this is what we think a risk culture is, but it's not, it's a financial services one, but it's actually not appropriate to the culture that you actually, or the industry you actually work in, then it's not going to help the business succeed. And then why are you doing it? And so we want to make sure that it aligns to these things. And then this is where you also decide that extent to which you want to integrate it. Is it going to be part, I've worked at companies where it's part of the company scorecard, where it's part of people's individual goals. You don't need to sort of jump into that, but you have to think about, is that something that would work in your organization, or is it more important to include risk into critical decisions, or critical decisions that your organization makes about, its information technology, about its new products, about its new markets? Maybe you're moving to other, jurisdictions outside of your own country, and that's what you really need to focus on in the first instance. And that goes to whether it's realistic. And that goes to the project management of it. Where do we need to start? Like, what is the burning platform here? Where do we need to start that will make the most impact? What's most impactful to in line of our company as a whole? And a key point here as well that I will say is, do you have support in the right areas, right? This is right before we're executing. You're coming up with how you want the company to act, how it fits in with your broader, and some of these goals are outside of the remit of, say, a risk or compliance team. If you're starting to talk about performance, if you're talking about, how business cases and things are decided. So you really need to make sure that the leaders of your organization at this point are on board with the same vision that you have and the same strategy and roadmap that you have around the kind of part risk management considerations will play in the culture that you have. And how can you gain support and strategically position the risk function to ensure its voice and visibility? And I mentioned that because not because people in that area are not always the ones to come forward first and promote their programs, but you need to find a way to do that if you want to be successful in that area. So the fourth step, we're looking at execution, and we're looking at therefore change. And I have to say, one of the key failures I see of risk programs in general is that they're not communicated well often. Now, it's not to say that they're not on the intranet or they haven't been included in formal reports, but if you're talking about, getting to culture within all employees of an organization and making them know, making them care and so on, there needs to be more than that. So you need to look at whether there's enough collaboration between risk teams and HR and people teams, because you're talking about culture and that's the world that they operate, that both teams are going to be operating in. Then depending on the priorities that you've established in these earlier stages, that could be the security team. It probably will be, because cyber is such a huge risk now. But it could also be safety if you work in something like, a mining company, and it could be legal if you're heavily regulated. So you need to make sure that those inputs are coming in from those teams. There's enough collaboration. As I said, there's enough support, that you have taken a change management approach. So you're thinking about why people might be feeling resistance to these sorts of changes, and how you can overcome their objections, if there are any, and have an answer to that, rather than just sort of communicating, this is what we're doing now. And then when it comes to the topic of communication, a lot of people, I don't know why, but a lot of people find risk dry and technical. I don't, I work in it. But if that's the case, then they're going to find your communication boring. So you need to make sure that it's engaging when you come to that point. Take a leaf out of the PR and the marketing and the salespeople. Like, how is this helping them succeed? How is it helping them with their own pain points? Or the method doesn't gel with the general culture of learning. Is your organization more face-to-face now, but you're rolling out a module that's black and white that nobody wants? Or are you trying to get people to come to your face-to-face session that actually, everybody just does online bite-sized training now? So think about that. And in reality, what I'd say is that you really need to focus on this stage as much of the rest. Sometimes with risk programs in particular, people see the rollout as a bit of an afterthought, and then we'll roll it out. But actually, this is the crucial point, especially since we are talking about culture and we're talking about communication and engagement. We also need to be communicative and engaging when we do that. So I just want to go back to those points that I mentioned at the start where there's a barrier. And so you want to think about that when you're rolling it out. We said that the barriers were people don't know, people don't care, or they find it hard. So make sure that you're making people know. Like I say, this is probably the easiest part. If you take that communication approach I talked about, make them care. And this is where you're drawing the relevance to your organization, making them aware of the issues in the world, like that Kanan talked about earlier, that would affect their organization and affect their jobs, and really linking it to why it's part of your job and not just an afterthought that you can do later. And then making it easy. And so that's the embedding side. How can we just make it easy for people to know, I'm employing some new people, I'm bringing on a new partner, I'm bringing on a new vendor. How can I make it easy to engage in the controls that you've put in place and make sure that, I can just manage this risk? Have we thought about that? All right, so the last part, the fifth stage, if you will, is about how do we measure, once we've put this in place, how do we measure it and how do we sustain it? So the first thing I'm going to say is that there is informal measures that I've always worked with, that you just know when you're in charge of it, when things have changed. And they will be things like, instead of you knocking on everyone's door, trying to get them to use your controls, trying to get them to include, report on their risks, people will start coming to you because they'll be proactive and they'll be concerned and they will care. Or they might be so proactive, they don't need you anymore because risk just appears in business cases. It appears in meetings. They want to run their own workshops and discussions. I've had this happen to me before, and that's how I measured whether it was working. That said, you also need formal measures and metrics because basically, modern business demands it. Boards and executives want to see it, but also it will help you when you're measuring whether your actions have actually made a difference. So when you talk about 3 different types of metrics that you might use, and again, I'm not going to go into all the specifics because it will be so different for each organization. But the first bucket of that is around your initial risk culture assessment. So that's basically revisiting what you assessed before and seeing your progress either year on year or in 6 months, or whatever you deem is the appropriate time to review that. And this will be really useful when, you know, you have done something like a survey of those initial metrics. So it doesn't need to be something new. You can revisit awareness, how aware people are, what they understand, what their attitudes and perceptions are, how they view their leaders, are they walking the talk, and that sort of thing. And also, can they speak up? But it's also an opportunity to bring together in that second bucket, some disparate metrics. And these might already be in place in your organisation, but what you're doing is bringing together a dashboard of metrics that are relevant to culture. So as an example, if you are looking at safety accidents or near misses, then you'll be focusing on those incidents, measuring those incidents where, you know, human decision was a factor, where decisions people have made and the culture around them has affected whether or not there was an accident. Similarly, with cybermetrics, you might be looking at focusing on internal behaviour rather than the external attacks. You might be looking at your controls and saying, well, how often are these being used and how effective were they? You'd be doing that anyway, but you're looking at it now more from the perspective of what that means from human behaviour and culture. And the key, as I said, is they need to be relevant to what your priorities are that you established earlier on in the process. They can be new metrics if there was a gap that you identified earlier, but they don't always need to be. So don't be afraid to use and leverage what is there already. And then the third bucket is there are general cultural metrics that you can use in relation to people. So they could be things like training, the amount of, you know, has there been an uptick in the amount of training that people are doing around risk generally, around compliance, around, you know, people and safety and so on. But they can also be, a lot of organisations will include risk within their employee engagement survey and ask for the attitudes there. And also comments in engagement surveys can be quite revealing about risk. Do people feel like they can speak up and raise things? What does that say about your culture and how empowered it is? And then you can also look at progress against your plan, basically implementation, progression. How far have you embedded the risk? All right, so just recapping then the 5 stages, looking at your target state risk culture. What does it look like? But specifically, what does it look like for you in your organisation? Assessing your current culture and gaps. What methods will you use, and what will the scope of that be? Making sure that your risk culture goals are aligned to your company's strategy and aligned to the values and culture that you have, and how will you get there? When you execute, definitely taking a change management approach that takes regard for people and how they will respond in particular, and then measuring and sustaining. So as you go on, you know, how are we improving? How will you measure that? And how will that be sustained? So I don't know which one of these you identify with, where you go next, but a strong risk culture is definitely up to you. Your organization's risk culture is there whether you take action or not, but the strong risk culture is definitely up to you. So where do you want to be? Where are you now? And how will you get where you need to go? So just before Kanan goes on, from my perspective, I am offering some free risk culture, I'm calling them micro sessions during September. If you want to talk about those specifics that obviously we can't get to in a mass call like this, and so feel free to definitely book a session. You can see the direct link there. Also, there is the QR code. Having worked in payments technology, I love QR codes. But definitely this is designed to be a 30-minute session that then can be tailored to your specific questions, ideas, and challenges. So that will be available. And I also have some contact details here. If you're not ready for a session, feel free to contact me or follow me or connect on LinkedIn. So thank you very much. That's my portion of it. And now I'll throw to Kanan.
Obviously, like what Francesca talked about, there are risks in many areas across the functions, across the departments that you need to manage. But I would like to just focus on the people related, which, you know what, all businesses are made up of people. So you have to manage their risks so that you do not end up with other related risks. So at the individual level and a company level, right, I'd like to slice it in 2 different ways. So when you're onboarding someone as part of the organization, I think today, like what I earlier said, out of every 10 profiles, 3 to 4 have some kind of issues, right? So criminal check, for example, in the UK, we have the DBS checks, in Australia, we have the AFP checks. You want to be able to do that. And of course, for higher risk roles, you might want to do across more longer period of time. So a higher risk role, let's say CXO or a cybersecurity person or IT security person, you want to cover them across the last 10 years, for example. So obviously, the tenure of the checks, the kind of checks, the mix of checks that you want to do on these people would really depend on the role, right? And that's where we will come in to help you to identify the right mix of checks that you need to be able to do. So whether it's criminal, civil, money laundering, political exposure, terrorism related, sexual offenses, checks like global sanction, you have social media, which Xiang mentioned earlier, you have your finance, your identity checks as well. And then you have your things like your whether does the person have any inaccurate or inflated employment background or fake certificates. I think we all know now that it takes you less than $5 to create a fake certificate of an educational background, right? So you could actually get a Harvard certificate in for less than $5 now. So that's how easy it is to fake things, which is why you really got to verify the authenticity of these documents. And we have built up tech platforms called Screen Global, where you can go in, select the checks, and we can easily manage that for you. So while Screen Global takes care of that, we also have the company due diligence through a platform called CDD Global, again, a tech-based platform. So again, it could be a potential business partners, could be JV, vendors, investment targets, your customers as part of a KYC process, as you know, and even when engaging channel partners across the world to manage or to sell your products, right? So you want to be able to check whether they have any non-compliance to money laundering, anti-money laundering, any fraud, embezzlement, financial irregularities, corrupt, like your Anti-Bribery Act, OECD, FCPA, and all that, right? Undesirable liabilities that they have, hidden political links, political exposure, terrorism links, counterfeiting, IPR infringement. And the second last point is a very important one, conflicting directorships, because now if you want to like launder money, that nobody does it directly, right? They do it through a web of complex interconnected companies to do that. I mean, yesterday there was a case which came to us, and when we did the conflict of interest or the directorship this person has, there were 51 companies under this guy's name. 51 companies. So imagine how much of irregularities is going to pop up. And a lot of these companies were not even transacting revenues. I think they were all probably just transferring money one to the other. So it's very hard to look at the trail. But you know what? The authorities are getting smarter. Companies like us will help you to get smarter so that you will be able to trace back the source of the funds, right? I'm sure some of you, your banks would have come after you asking you questions like, random audits, what is the source of fund, where the money is going in, coming out. So all these things are getting very important, which is why analyzing the business relationships is also really crucial, right? So a lot of these things, whether you're doing it yourself or engaging a partner like us, Avvanz, to help you, just make sure that you get thorough, right? Because the more thorough you go on an individual level check or a company level check, better it is. But the good news is now we have platforms which leverage AI. You got your RPA, which is robotic process automation, even blockchain ledgers to do a lot of these checks for you. Definitely, I would like to see whether you have any questions here before we go into specifics. In the future, we would like to actually show you some case studies as well on how we manage this. But if you do have any questions and you need some help on how to go about building a risk management strategy, which Francesca has talked about, but more focused on the people and the company risk, that's where we would come in. I will let the team take over, Xiang and Vince.
Thanks, Francesca. Thanks, Kanan. Appreciate all the insights you've given us. And maybe a quick question for Francesca, from my perspective at least. Avvanz, we are a HR technology company, and as Kanan has alluded to, we leverage to a great extent technology to kind of facilitate what we do. Right, it's going to be impossible for actually manual checks to happen based on the number of checks we do, the level of intensity that we get into each and every check. Right, are there technologies that play as far as risk management, risk assessment, and risk mitigation is concerned on your side of the business in risk management? Because with AI and cognitive technologies coming into play, deepfakes and all that, that's got to be a huge threat to any organizations in the trust space.
Yeah, I think what a lot of organizations are focusing on is grappling with it at the leadership level. So I see a lot of discussion about that and getting to understand what artificial intelligence means. I know that for example, earlier this year, obviously, because of ChatGPT, it kind of came into the public consciousness and now everybody knows about it. But, the ethics of AI and algorithms and things like that have been discussed, I think, in the IT sector for quite a while. And it really, I think it comes back to the knowledge and then tailoring it back to your organization again, and looking at how it could benefit, but also not benefit. I think, in your particular area, how it relates to data gathering, I think as well, because that's not something we talked about. That's such a big, huge issue at the moment, and having those controls. And I think because it's moving at such a pace, I think, organizations that are looking at educating their people about risk, I think data and technology development is a big one. If you work in technology, that probably is happening to an extent anyway. But I think it's really, really important for all organizations to have that understanding of, if I just connect to this, I'm an employee and I've just, what, it's so much easier for me to use this piece of software, I'll just plug it in. And you don't have those controls around it, then you have to have the person sitting and thinking, what data is this going to take? What's it going to do? Unless you're thinking more broadly, and then strategically, is this going to end our service? That's a whole different ball game as well. But yeah, and I think the other aspect of that is we don't really know what the regulations will be yet. That's all still developing so fast. And then, even in terms of, how you manage risk and data as well, then obviously for some of this data around, how your risks are trending, you can use technology that exists in your organizations to harness that data for risk, monitoring purposes as well.
Yeah,
but you need the skills, the capability.
Even in hospital, they have a SOC coming in, right? The critical infrastructure, I believe August 18.
It's in already. Yeah, so they're designated.
Yeah, well, tell us about it.
But it also, that regulates certain, question without notice, thank you. That regulates certain organizations that have been designated in critical areas. So that goes from sort of energy and, big into technology. So whatever people are relying on, it requires them to have a certain specific risk management programs. Also allows potentially governments to step in where to have a greater say in how those risks or incidents rather are managed, because it affects so many people potentially, and how the country runs. But I know Australia is looking at its cyber strategy, national cyber strategy at the moment. And so whilst that legislation currently refers to really specific organisations, that could easily broaden later this year. They're looking at putting in a cyber act as well, potentially, that will bring all of this together. There's a lot of reform in Australia around privacy legislation as well. There's 116 recommendations that are up for review. That's all publicly available. But there's certainly a lot in this area, and it's not increasingly going to affect more organisations than just, technology or financial services. It's also, the Prudential Authority here as well, APRA, is also having a greater focus on supplies to those businesses, so you don't have to be a bank. So I could talk about this a lot because I did work in payments, but there is a lot going on.
I just want to say how you manage the risk of expecting unexpected questions. Anyway, we are going to be talking about it in a couple of weeks, and we'll invite everyone as well on the critical infrastructure through another consultant partner of ours to talk through how to start getting ready for this. Or I think there's a grace period of 6 months. I think every jurisdiction there's something, right? There's a consultation papers running in many countries on relating to risks associated with people and companies. Sorry, I know we're running out of time.
And they all, and the influences come, something happens in one jurisdiction and all the other jurisdictions. You look at AI and, in Europe, there have been restrictions, and in China, and then, that you've got to think will then affect the rest of the Asia Pacific region as well. And,
I think we need to be on top of the game all the time. I think that's the purpose of education webinars like this, to let people be alert and get prepared for it, right? Because when the regulatory requirements come at you, you sometimes do not have enough time to react. And even if you're ready to react, the people who can help you with are probably bogged down with a lot of work, and they might not get the time. So I think this is a good time
specialist.
to,
but that's where you need to be the one. Your
Yeah.
employees, it all comes back, I think, to that awareness. Your employees need to be sitting and thinking, oh, this is coming, or we're moving into this area. What do we need to think about when it comes to risk? And they often will think of opportunity already. So it's just about balancing the two, I think.
Thanks, guys. Again, Francesca, Kanan, thanks for your time on this. And everyone who has joined us, really appreciate you spending an hour with us in the afternoon. We'll be putting together a kit, right? A short recording of this video, of this webinar. And also, if there are any questions and answers that we come across or you've posted, we'll put them on also and we'll send them across to you. And our contact details will be there as well. All right. Okay. Thanks again, and
Thanks,
have a great week ahead. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.